All right. Well, thanks everyone for having me here today. I think it's really appropriate that this seminar is titled Listening to Farmed Animals, because the title of my thesis and sort of the subject of my work is If I Could Talk to the Animals, Measuring Subjective Animal Welfare. And what I'm particularly interested in is the ways in which we can measure animal welfare, the way that we can find out what life is like from the point of view of animals, and the way that we can do so scientifically. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about this work that made up my PhD thesis and what I'm working on in general. So I'm working currently at the London School of Economics, part of the Foundations of Animal Sentience project, which is also called ASENT, under Dr. Jonathan Birch. And what we do there is we answer a lot of different questions like what is sentience, how do we measure it, which animals have it, what's its distribution. And the question that I'm particularly interested in and what I'm working on is looking at the links between animal sentience and animal welfare. So how is it that the sentience of animals and the research of the sentience of animals links into how we understand their welfare and how we can design better treatment for them? So a little bit of background on me. I started out working in zoos. And so in zoos, we sort of connected to animal welfare quite a bit. It makes up the large part of our jobs as zookeepers, trying to give the animals the best possible lives they can, trying to learn what we can about their welfare and how to ensure it. But another thing we do is a lot of animal encounters and sort of public education and connection with wildlife. And one of these encounters included the Meja cheetah, which you can see in these photos here, where we bring people in to meet some of our cheetahs and learn something about them. And so one of the questions we get asked a lot here is, oh, do we let the cheetahs run? And so we have a fairly standard answer for that. We say, well, actually, cheetahs don't really like to run that much. You know, in the wild, despite what you'd see in documentaries, they actually only spend about 30 to 60 seconds of their day running after prey. And they go full pelt, you know, very, very fast, as a cheetah does. And after that, they actually go into muscle meltdown. And they have to rest for about 20 minutes to recover before they can even start eating their prey. So this running is extraordinarily stressful on their system. And it's something that when they don't have to do it, they don't actually seem to want to do. So they don't really like to run. They do it because they have to. When they're here in captivity, they're quite happy to not do so. You know, despite the large enclosures that they've got here, they don't ever really run around. And you say this enough times and start sort of thinking, okay, but how do we really know? You know, we say these things about what cheetahs may or may not want, what they may or may not like. How is it that I actually know, or how can I find out? And that's what led me into this some more academic research program of looking at animal welfare. So I started my PhD research on questions in animal welfare science, looking at it from a philosophical point of view, this sort of philosophy of animal welfare. And so even though I work in philosophy, I don't really do animal ethics so much. There are little bits of that. Mostly what I'm interested in is actually the philosophy of science questions. So questions about how we conceptualize and measure welfare and how we can do that well. And then obviously there are ethical implications to that. And so some of my work sort of follows that as well. So to begin with, the most important question to me seemed to be to just establish what welfare is. So we're talking about something that we want to measure, something we want to know about. We need to know what it is we're talking about. What is the concept of welfare that we're working with? And welfare is interesting because it's a concept that forms these two different roles. So it's an ethical concept. It's something that we want to build our ethical theories around. So it needs to be something that's morally relevant. We want welfare to be something that we care about. It's also a scientific concept. So welfare has to be something that we can measure, something that we can use in a scientific context so that we can get the information that we need. And the concept of welfare that I think fits these roles best is subjective animal experience. So this is referring to the mental states of our animals, what's going on in their head, their kind of feelings. And an animal will have good welfare if it's got mostly positive mental states, and it will have bad welfare in cases where it has excess of negative mental states. So when we think of the sort of welfare of the animal, what we're thinking about is this subjective experiencing over its lifetime. So we're focusing here on just a wide range of different experiences, and sometimes called feelings or affects. And these can include a whole variety of things. So hunger, illness, thermal comfort, boredom, loneliness, curiosity, fear, resting comfort. All these different things are all kinds of the experiences that build the welfare profile of an animal. And so you can think of it as something like this. This is a nice little graphic that came from the Zoo and Aquarium Association in Australia, where you can see you've got this positive and negative welfare going up and above this line, and all these different experiences that are coming in and shaping what the overall welfare experience of the animal is, and that we want the balance of those to be on the positive side. We don't want it to dip too far into the negative. We want to make sure that it's outweighed. So there are different concepts of welfare as well. I'm not going to talk too much about these, but some of the more common ones are biological functioning accounts that take welfare to be sort of more on the health and functioning of an animal from a physical point of view. So these can sometimes be its biological fitness. There's also natural living accounts, which is looking at the natural behaviours, sort of the way the animal exists in the wild and how closely it might match that. And preference-based accounts that looks at animals having the things that they want. And now I think all of these things are going to be really important for welfare, but I think as pure welfare concepts, they don't work very well. I think they're all things that count in virtue of the way that they affect this other thing that we're talking about, which is this subjective experiencing. So yeah, the health of an animal is going to matter because it doesn't feel good to be sick or injured. You know, natural behaviours are important because animals can feel frustrated or bored when they don't perform the behaviours they want to perform. Preferences, the same thing. The things that animal wants is usually going to be the things that make it feel good. The things that it wants to avoid are the things that makes it feel bad. So these are all sort of instrumentally very important for welfare, but don't themselves ground the concept of welfare the way that subjective experiencing does. So we think of these dual roles for our welfare concept. Like I was saying, we've got an ethical concept. And so subjective experiencing seems to play this ethical role for us. It's very common now to talk about sentience, which is the capacity of an animal to have these positive and negative experiences all. To be sentient is to be an experiencing subject such that you can have these feelings or affects. And when we're looking at how we decide which animals get to be part of our moral sphere, who we give ethical consideration to, generally what we're thinking about is which animals are sentient. So, you know, there's a lot of work at the moment looking at whether we legislate to include protections for decapod crustaceans like this lobster here. And most of that turns on questions of whether or not they are sentient. Can they feel pain? Can they suffer? And so this sort of tracks back to some early work in utilitarian philosophy. Jerry McBentham here has quite famously got this quote, and he said, the question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? And it's this ability to suffer that seems to ground our moral concern. And that ability to suffer is that subjective experiencing. The more recently, Peter Singer's work, his Animal Liberation, a highly influential book in animal ethics. And again, he grounded it in this idea of animal interests. And to possess interests, one needed to be a sentient being. They need to be able to experience pleasures and suffering. And so these sort of ethics of animals very, very often are based in this subjective experiencing, and it certainly seems to be something that we think is morally important. But it also needs to be a scientific concept, like I said. And one of the biggest sort of pushbacks against this subjective experiencing view, at least for a long time, was that people weren't sure that it would be something that was measurable. We're talking about subjective experiences, these feelings and thoughts that are happening inside the heads of our animals. And so they seem like they're private. We can't access them for measurement. And the tradition of behaviorism that came through a large part of last century was held that mental states are unscientific. They're not appropriate targets of scientific inquiry. And so what we should be doing instead is focusing on behaviors. And that's what they did in a lot of the animal sciences and even a lot of the human sciences as well. And so it was looking at, you know, operant conditioning, looking at the preferences, behaviours of animals, without saying anything about the mental states that stood behind them, because that was not considered to be the appropriate target scientific concern. So you think, you know, can we know something about subjective states? Animals have got these mental states. Is it scientific to say something about them? And I think I'm not alone in this, that most people now would agree that we can know something about the subjective states of animals. That, you know, there are ways that we can measure and reasonably think that we're saying something about what's happening in their minds. And part of this comes from analogy to humans. So we know that we're having experiences, and we know that there are aspects of our behavior and our physiology that respond to the experiences that we have, and that can be signs. You know, we move towards things we like, we move away from things we don't like. Our heart beats faster when we're afraid. Our blood cortisol levels increase when we're stressed. All these sorts of things, we've got these feelings, they cause things to happen in our body and they cause things to happen in the world. And because we think of this range of animals that have similar anatomy and physiology to ourselves, all sorts of biological similarities, similar evolutionary histories, we have reasons to believe that the same things are going to be true for them as well. And I don't mean here in exactly the same way. I don't mean that animals are going to respond precisely how we do. There are species-specific differences in the biologies and the responses. More, I mean that the fact that there are measurable outputs that come from the subjective experiences is something that we think is going to be common. Because otherwise what we need to say is that these experiences of animals are epiphenomenal. They don't have any causal power in the world. And that seems like a slightly strange thing to say if we think that this is an evolved trait that animals have come up with. It must be doing something for them. There must be some effects in the world that we can measure and track. And that means that welfare is going to be something that science can look at and science can measure, even when we think about it subjectively. And so the measurement of welfare is the thing that I'm interested in then. Say, okay, we might have established that we can detect it, that there are these traces that it will leave in the world, but we also want to measure it, which sort of goes beyond just that. We need to assign values to the things that we're measuring. And so this is the part that I'm really interested in and that I sort of did a lot of my thesis work on. We want to be able to make judgments about animals and things like, so we can make ordinal measures, which is rankings or comparisons. And that's being able to say that one set of conditions is better, the welfare of an animal is better in this condition than this condition, or this animal has a higher welfare than this other animal. We can compare and rank them. Often we want to do a little bit more than that. So we actually want this sort of further quantitative information. How much better is the welfare of this animal compared to this other animal? In a sense, to sort of put it a little bit flat-footedly, we want to know about these units of welfare. How many units of welfare does an animal gain or lose in particular situations, and how could we compare them? So say we want to know, is it a better use of our resources to invest in buying a new pool for our tiger or putting a bunch of new exhibit furniture in for our otters? We need to know the comparative benefits that we're giving each of these animals, and that requires us to quantify the welfare benefit. Or for a single animal, we might think, is it worth it to put this kangaroo under a surgery, have him castrated, so that then he can actually live quietly with the females and young animals in the group? He gets the social benefits and the behavioural benefits of that. Does that offset the negative experiences he has in being caught up and given this surgery? And again, in order to compare these trade-offs, we want to quantify sort of the units of welfare here. And I'm not going to talk a lot here. It's not really time to justify exactly why I think this works, but very roughly, I think we can use these quantitative ratio scales to be able to measure welfare and to give it this sort of numerical descriptions. And that's because we can think of welfare as occurring on this continuum with a 0 point. So we've got welfare that can vary from being good all the way down to being very poor. And there's this neutral point in the middle, which is sort of, neither positive nor negative. It's this 0 point of welfare where you can get above or below. And once you've got that, you can assign units all the way up and all the way down. And you can use these divisions in this scale then to make comparisons and talk about the different kinds of welfare and the trade-offs that you're making. Now, this leads on to the next issue, which is something that I'm working on at the moment, which is, if we've got these scales, how might we compare them between different species? And so what I'll talk about here is not finished work. I'm not sure that there's an easy answer for this, but I'll sort of go over the way that I'm thinking about this at the moment, and particularly the way that I covered it in my PhD thesis. So like I said, we can think of these scales for an animal, and think about their good and poor welfare and all the units in between. But is that going to be the same thing for a cow to a pig, or a pig for a chicken? Or you get even sort of more distantly related to a fish. Are they going to have these same scales of welfare? And we can think about it like this. You can think about your cow having his scale. You think about this fish having hers. And, perhaps it's possible that just the range of experiences or intensities that a fish is capable of is just not as wide as that of a cow. Or perhaps it's wider. I've used this example because this is the more common view that people have, that the sort of, your higher vertebrates and your mammals have more experience and that it disappears as you go lower down, but there's no real evidence that that's the case at this point. A lot of people would like to say that humans have more experience. It makes us sort of more morally valuable, that our pleasures are more pleasurable, or that our pains are more painful than other kinds of animals because of our complexity of thoughts and mind. And that, perhaps the less like us you get, the less that happens. A lot of people might think that invertebrates are very, very simple, and so that they only have very, very basic diminished pleasures and pains. The question is, how would we know? So, you know, this may or may not be the case. It may turn out that we all have the same units of welfare. It may turn out that they're vastly different and we need to find ways. So what I'm interested in is how we find out so that we can make these comparisons. And again, I'm just sort of gesturing here, but what we're looking at is converting these units of welfare between the different types of animals. So, you know, you've got scales if you want to measure length, you've got centimeters and inches, if you want to measure temperature, you have Fahrenheit and Celsius. And we've got these ratios, we've got these formulas for converting between one and the other. And what we want is something like that for being able to convert between different animals if it turns out that they're not just the same kinds of units. So roughly what I think we need to do in these cases is we need to think about what are the relevant similarities between these animals that can ground background assumptions that we can then use to make these comparisons. So I say here relevant similarities. It's important that things are similar in the right kind of ways that matter to welfare. So obviously surface similarities like I've pictured here aren't going to be sufficient, but we need to think about the ways in which welfare is actually realized. What are the mechanisms by which animals create experience? So we're talking about, you know, the neural mechanisms and also the mechanisms by which they create the responses that we're measuring. So when we're looking at the experiences of animals, we're measuring behaviors, we're measuring physiology. We need to understand how an intensity of experience produces a particular intensity of output so that we're able to think about how to make these comparisons. And this is where sentience research comes in. So for instance, if we were to examine sort of different brains and find similarities in the relevant structures or functions of the brains, we might think that that's a similar intensity of experience. So we might think, well, you know, the amount of pleasure, the amount of pain you have is going to be some function of the way particular parts of the brain work, either structural similarities or perhaps functional similarities. I don't think it necessarily has to be the same thing. But if we see the right kinds of similarity, once we understand how this works a bit better, then we can think perhaps they have the same intensity of experience. And this might give us good reason to think that, say, two different cows would have a very similar intensity of welfare to one another. They're very unlikely to be vastly different, but perhaps our cow and our fish more likely to be different from one another. The other thing we can look at is the response mechanisms like I was talking about. So we might think about the way it is that the experiences that we have trigger the hormone cascades that give rise to the stress responses, the blood cortisol that we might measure as a stress response. And if those mechanisms are very similar between different animals, say that they've occurred quite early on, the common ancestor of vertebrates, such that cows and fish have very, very similar mechanisms, if that were the case, then we might say, well, look, our measures of cortisol are going to be a good way of making these comparisons that, you know, if you can see a high amount in one animal and a low amount in another, you can think that one animal is just having a more intense experience than another one based on the similarities here. And again, I'm not making any strong claims about whether or not this is actually going to turn out to be the case, but this is just going to be based on our understanding of these particular mechanisms. And the more indicators that we use and bring together, we can sort of correlate the data between them. The more things that seem to point us in the same direction, the more reason we have to think that this is an answer that's going to be relevant to us here. So we might think that, yeah, if we want to compare more dissimilar animals, these things might work as well. So like I said, this is just going to be part of our ongoing research into animal sentience. So this is, you know, part of the project that I'm involved in now, is we need to understand how it is that the subjective brains of animals work. What is it that gives rise to these experiences that we're sort of interested in? Are they going to be structural features? You know, do you need a neocortex? Can you have brains that are vastly different, like some of the invertebrate brains we look at? Are there just going to have to be functional similarities or similarities in connectivity? All these sorts of things. And the more that we understand about that, the more we can find the similarities that we need to perhaps start making these comparisons and doing the kinds of measurements that we want. And the idea would be, ideally, eventually we should be able to learn enough to get perhaps some sorts of proxies to the level of sentience. So I've put one here. I think this is probably actually a terrible candidate for it, which is the number of neurons in the brain. But there's all these sorts of candidates that we can think about that might help us figure out the differences between different animals. So it could be brain size to body ratios. It could be the relative size of different parts of the brain. It could be the intensity of neural firing in different parts of the brain. It could be the complexity of the connections between the neurons in certain areas. Once we understand much more what it is that gives rise to this sentient experience, this experience that grounds welfare, we'll be in a much better place to figure out which animals have more or less of it, and perhaps get something like what some people would call a sentience multiplier. So essentially that gives us this function that we can use to understand the differences between the animals, so that we can figure out, you know, which animals have more or less of this experience than others, if indeed they do at all. And so to finish up, I think that the measurement of subjective welfare is possible. This isn't an unscientific target. Talking about the mental states of animals, talking about animal consciousness, this isn't something that science should be avoiding anymore. It's something that realistically that we can be doing. It's something that realistically we can be drawing conclusions about, but it is very, very complex, and it's something that is an ongoing research project that we need to understand more of. And for that reason, we need this sort of multidisciplinary research of the sort that, you know, we're doing on the ASENT project at LSE, of the sort that you're all getting together here and doing right now. And that's using, say, philosophers like myself to help figure out the concepts that we're using to help, you know, establish the methods, the background assumptions, the way that this is working, look at the ethical implications. We use welfare scientists to help develop the kinds of indicators and to examine the way that these differ between species or change under different conditions. And sentience researchers who can help us understand, you know, how it is that these brains work, how it is that sentient experience is produced in animals at all, and how it links to all the responses that we're looking at. And all these sorts of research projects, and others as well, can come together and help us answer more of these questions and figure out a little bit more about animal welfare, about the experience of animals within their own minds. And that in the long run just helps us understand more about what animals are thinking and feeling. And that allows us to give them better lives from their own point of view, so that we can understand them better. Yeah, thank you.